follow.
Hello and welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I am Ken Coughlan here with you every week, and this week we actually are bringing you something kind of unique and different. And let me get started here by explaining to you what we're going to do today, and then I will explain who the mystery person is that's sitting over here to my right. So today's topic is what's called Ask the Apologist. And what we decided to do is we wanted to take an opportunity, obviously, when people, especially when they're reaching the high school age, Christians in high school can be confronted, they're starting to be confronted by a lot of questions about their faith from people outside of it. They're getting to an age where they're really starting to have to think on their own. And so what we did is we kind of took a poll of questions from high schoolers and asked them what questions did they have about the Christian faith. We asked some of the high schoolers here at Trinity. I also reached out to some of my fellow Christian apologists and asked them, hey, when you guys are talking to this community, to the high school community, what kind of questions are you coming across? And so they've given us some suggestions as well. Some of the most common questions that are kind of bugging people of that age group before they kind of go out into the quote-unquote real world and have to answer these questions on their own. So the purpose of this episode is we're going to talk about some of those questions, and we're going to ask them and give the best answers that we can. And before we go into too much more detail about how that's all going to work, I'm going to go introduce this lovely lady over here to my right. Hi. In order to adequately she is our representative of high schoolers everywhere. This is my daughter, Sarah Coughlan. Say hi, Sarah.
Hi. I am Sarah, and you really should have found someone who is more accurately described the teenage demographic.
Just so you know a little bit, this is called Ask the Apologist. For those of you that aren't familiar with that term, what is an apologist? The term apologist actually comes from the Greek word apologia. It's from 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. The word reason in there is apologia in Greek, and that's where we get apologist or apologetics. And it basically means giving an answer, being prepared when someone comes to you with questions about your faith, being prepared with answers for them. And so that's what apologists do, is that we are the ones that go out there and we try to provide answers to the questions that the world is asking. So my background in apologetics actually started back when I graduated from law school. I mentioned a number of times on the show before that I'm a lawyer, so I do have a law degree, graduated in 1998 from the College of William & Mary Law School. And one thing they teach you in law school is, it's very much a logic, reasoning type based education where you have to reason through problems and investigate, leave no stone unturned, so to speak. Think things through thoroughly. And so naturally, I think when I came out of that, my response was, okay, well, I start rationally examining everything. And one of the things I wanted to rationally examine was the Christian faith. And so I approached my pastor at the time, and the original approach I took to it was, because I had no idea. I'd never heard the term apologetics. I had no idea that whole field was even out there at the time. And I just wanted to look, okay, supposedly all of these Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus in the New Testament. So that's where I started. And I went up to my pastor at the time and I asked for some resources that I could use to look at that, to investigate Old Testament prophecies fulfilled by Jesus. And that's kind of what started it. I started looking into that and researching that, was kind of amazed by what I found there. And that led me into other apologetics resources. And so over the past, however many years it's been since 1998, 20 years? 20. Oh my gosh, yes. I've been doing apologetics for 20 years?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm old. Don't say anything. So I started, just soaking up any resources I could get. I would take courses from the likes of Greg Kokel, Ravi Zacharias. I would study under, as many resources I can get from like William Lane Craig, C.S. Lewis, and then of course branched out and started, also studying opposing viewpoints, whether it be Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, things of that nature. And at the point where I'm now, actually, I'm currently enrolled at Luther Rice Seminary, pursuing a Master of Arts degree in criminal justice. No, that's what my undergrad was in. No, although I did get some master's level credits in criminal justice, but no, in Christian apologetics. So that's kind of where my background is here. So my daughter's role here is she's going to ask the questions, but she's the question asker, and so I'm going to turn things over to her, and let's get started. What do you say?
Sure.
All right. What's the first question that we're going to be looking at today?
The first question is, Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Jesus even existed?
It's funny because I polled folks. This is one of the questions that came from some of my fellow apologists who said they get confronted with this question a lot from the high school demographic. And they gave me this like a week ago or so. And I kid you not, just in the past like 2 days, I've had somebody ask me this question. I've had a discussion about a very similar question to this. And so it's just like, it's amazing. I just find it amazingly coincidental that after somebody said, "Oh, you got to address this on the show," it's like God was giving me a warm up by actually asking me, having somebody actually ask me the actual question. And the first thing I want to say here is the same thing I told that person. And the way this question is often phrased is just like you did. Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Jesus existed? And I want to encourage people, first of all, not to accept that condition. A lot of people, there's a belief out there that just because something's in the Bible, it must be, we must automatically have to discount that. And that's just bad history. I mean, that's just bad history. You don't need, as a historian, all right, you don't need to look at the books of the Bible as being inspired by God or having any kind of extra level of authority in order for them to be historically valuable works. They are still historical works. They're writings from 2,000 years ago that we can apply the exact same tests that historians would to them, and see, even if we don't accept them as being, divinely inspired, you can still learn things from them and look at them like you would any other historical book. And so there's really no reason to just automatically reject especially the New Testament text just because they happen to be included in the Bible. Yeah.
It's like, for any of the teenagers watching this, you can probably relate to this. If you're in history and you're writing an essay and you're supposed to find information from different sources, and it's like getting points off for using something from the Bible, which just doesn't make any sense because it's also a historical document. It's just as valid as everything else you're going to find.
Yeah, and you can apply the same tests to the biblical text they would apply to, and the historians would apply to any other ancient text. And you're going to look, when you're looking at any kind of historical document, historians are going to look for a couple different things to figure out what is reliable and what isn't. And it's entirely possible you may look in the same document and accept some aspects of what it says as being historic and reject other aspects. Now, what you can't do, and what you got to be careful not to do, is you don't want to just do that randomly, like what a lot of people do. And I had a conversation with someone else recently that I believe was doing this, where they would pick out, well, this part of the Bible supports what I want the conclusion to be, so I'm going to say that's true. This part doesn't, so I'm going to reject that part. You can't just do it randomly as kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, but but it is possible if you're applying the standard test to say, okay, this I think is reliable and this isn't. And things you're going to look for, like embarrassment. People don't tend to say things that make them look bad. So if somebody writes something in one of these books that makes them look bad, it's probably true, or at least more likely to be true. You're looking for things that's called like multiple attestation. In other words, whatever historical fact you're finding, is it only in one historical text, or are 4 or 5 different people saying the same thing? If more people are saying it, it's more likely to be true. Early attestation, how close in time? Did somebody say that, are they describing an event that happened just 10 years before they're writing, or are they describing an event that happened 200 years before they're writing? If you can find it in earlier text, it's more likely to be true. And the last one is like enemy attestation. If somebody who is opposed to your viewpoint still has to admit that something is true in their text. And we look at this for, like, if you're looking at Roman text or ancient Jewish texts, and even they are admitting things about Christianity, it's probably true, because they would not have a reason to be admitting these things. They'd probably rather not have to admit these things if they could. So you can take a look at these biblical texts, and you can apply these same tests that you would to any other text, and there are still going to be grains of truth and things you can pull out of, more than grains, things you can pull out of them as being true. So don't reject the biblical text right off the bat. They provide a lot of really good evidence that Jesus existed. Also, beyond that, there certainly are other non-biblical sources that do provide evidence that Jesus existed. I mentioned, Romans and Jewish historians. There's a very famous Jewish historian named Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He wrote around AD 93. For those of you that don't know, history as far as Jesus is concerned, Jesus' crucifixion was about 33 AD. So we're talking about somebody who wrote about 60 years after Jesus died, which, as far as historical terms is concerned, that's a blink of an eye. I mean, that's really, really close in time as far as what we're used to finding as far as historical documents. He wrote a book called Antiquities of the Jews, and he had in that work, it was actually multiple books. There were actually 2 references to Jesus in that work. One of which is in book 8. That's a little controversial. Some people think that later Christians added to that, But there's a reference in Book 10 that is not controversial at all, that everybody agrees, yes, this is absolutely correct. This is what he originally wrote. And he wrote in there about the martyrdom of James, Jesus' brother James, and he referred, in the context of doing that, he referred to him as being, James, the brother of Jesus, who was known as the Christ. And so here we have a Jewish historian admitting that there was this person named Jesus whose followers believed he was the Messiah. That's what Christ means, in case people didn't know that. They believed he was the Messiah, all within 60 years after Jesus' death. You've got Tacitus, was a Roman politician. He wrote a work called the Annals in AD 116. He specifically mentioned that Jesus was executed during the time when Pontius Pilate was the Roman prefect in charge of Judea. And so it's like he just provides, again, more enemy attestation of events that the Bible says actually happened and that Jesus actually existed. And the last one I'll give is a gentleman, I don't know if that's the right term for it, Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman politician. He wrote a letter to the emperor at the time, Emperor Trajan. This was around 112 AD. And he described how he was putting Christians on trial, and basically for no offense other than being Christian. And he gave them 3 chances to deny it. And if after 3 chances they didn't deny it, guess what he did to them?
You just said he would execute them.
Oh, I did?
What do you think he did to them? Gave them a teddy bear and sent them home.
Teddy bear wasn't invented yet, but that's okay. All right. Well, see, I was checking to see if you were
that
listening.
just makes it even more unlikely, which just supports the joke in general.
So there's 3 examples between Josephus, the Jewish historian, and then Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, both Romans, all of them no later than 116 AD, all of whom gave descriptions of the existence of Jesus Christ. So the answer to that is yes. And there's a reason why. There are some historians out there who are they're advancing what's called a mythicist position, where they try to say that Jesus didn't exist. There's a reason they're in the overwhelming minority, because the vast majority of historians do accept that Jesus was, in fact, a historic figure. What else we got? What's next?
Pretends he doesn't have notes that tell him what each of the questions are.
I'm not even pretending I don't have notes. I absolutely have notes.
Out of the thousands of religions in the world, why is Christianity the only right one?
The short answer to this is because Jesus said so. I mean, seriously, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. No one comes to the Father but by me. So if you're talking to a Christian and they ask this question, then that's the answer. I mean, the answer is because Jesus says there's only one way to God, and it's through him. Now, what about
God? You got to go through me.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if you are talking to a non-Christian, the way this question comes up an awful lot is people think, well, Jack, Christians are so arrogant. All these thousands of religions in the world, and you guys think you've got it right. What makes you so right and everybody else so wrong? And part of it, you want to, I want to say, when somebody asks you that question, and they say, well, where do you get off saying that you're right and everybody else is wrong? I just want to say, well, do you think I'm wrong to do that? Because it kind of points out, first of all, the inconsistency in asking the question. The person who's asking the question obviously thinks that they're right and you're wrong. And so there's nothing wrong with saying that someone else is wrong. That's what we all do. That's the nature of truth. That's the way it works. If something's true, then the opposite of it is false. It's called the law of non-contradiction. But as far as when you're looking at thousands of religions, what a lot of people say is there's so many out there, how can you possibly even know enough details about all of these religions to say that there could be some other religion that you haven't investigated adequately enough? Maybe that one's right and you just don't know enough about it. You can't possibly know everything there is to know about every single religion out there on the face of the earth. And they're right. I don't know every single thing there is to know about every religion on the face of the earth, but you don't have to. Because you can really, every religion that's out there can be boiled down, or more than that, every worldview. Some people will say atheism is not a religion. But some people say it is. But every worldview out there can really be boiled down to 3 categories. There's those that say that the natural world is all there is. There's those that say God is all there is. And there's those that say there's a natural world and there's God. You look at the first category that says the natural world is all there is. That's obviously your atheists. All right, they say there's no divine. The natural world, everything's the natural world. That's everything there is. If you look at the second category that says God is all there is, that's when you're looking at your Eastern and your New Age religions, whether it be Hinduism, Buddhism, and again, some of the New Age beliefs now that say that God is all or God is in all. And then your third category, where there's both God and a natural world, that would be, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. They fall under that category. And so once you figure out you can boil things down to these three broad categories, well, I don't need to address each religion specifically, because if I can exclude an entire category, take for example the first category that says the natural world is all there is. All right, well, I can exclude that entire category by showing any kind of evidence that there is more than a natural world. Any of these traditional arguments that are for the existence of God, cosmological argument, teleological argument, moral argument, any one of those that shows that if there's a God out there would eliminate any worldview that says, no, the natural world is all there is. Same thing with the worldviews that the Eastern, the Buddhist, and the Hindu religions and things like that say that the God, all there is God, everything's God. Well, any evidence that's going to show that that broad category is not true is going to eliminate that entire category. I'll give you an example with that second category, like Hinduism and Buddhism. They both share the belief that the ultimate goal of everybody is to eliminate desire. That's what you're striving to do, is you're trying to eliminate all desire. Well, you just ask a simple question. Well, then is it correct should you desire to eliminate desire? I mean, there's a contradiction there, right? And so if you could show something like that, then that's not just going to eliminate Hinduism. I don't need to know every single detail about every single belief that falls under that category. If they all share that same belief, then it's going to eliminate the whole broad category. So that really, once you do that, that leaves you with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. That's really what you're dealing with under this one category that says there's both a God and a natural world. And so you really just need to focus on those three. Judaism, obviously Christians would say that Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism. So I'm not really in a position of having to disprove Judaism per se. I just have to show that it was fulfilled in the Messiah, in Jesus Christ. And then Islam, you get into the nature of God. I just did an episode a few weeks ago on answering... what did we call that one? Questions. Defining Christian terms, that's right. Where we talked a little bit about the nature of God. And I talked in there about some of the differences between the Islamic view of what God is like and the Christian view of what God is like. So I won't go into all that again here. Watch that episode. But I do talk a little bit there about how you can know that, no, the Christian view of God is more consistent with what we see in the world. So that's how you do that. What else you got for me? Keep them coming, keep them coming, keep them coming.
I cannot see, the lights are very bright. Okay. The third question is from Gabby Spencer. Actual person brought in this question. How can you tell...
Those are the fake people that raised all the other questions. Yes.
Yes. Shout out to Gabby Spencer.
Woohoo!
How can you tell someone about God and your faith without sounding like you're trying to convert them? You can relate to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I got to say, I liked this question when Gabby asked it, because unlike all the other questions that are asked today, this is the only one that really is, I guess you'd say, practical. This is not about, tell me what the facts are. This is about, how do I even go about doing this? Even if I knew everything, how do I go about practically talking to people? And the first thing I want to say to you, Gabby, is first, I think this isn't so much, just on an individual basis with you particularly. It's more of a cultural issue I think we've got. Try to get past this idea that there's something wrong with trying to convert people. We do it all the time. We don't use that word, convert, but how about if I use the word convince instead, persuade? When I was growing up, and I was a philosophy minor in undergrad, and one of the things we talked about a lot in my philosophy classes was the marketplace of ideas. And that's the idea that the best way to discover what's true is by having a free marketplace where people can debate and bring up other ideas and weigh them against each other. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. But that entire idea hinges on, if you and I have a disagreement, which we never do, then we should be free to talk about, and debate, and the mere fact that we're disagreeing doesn't mean that we hate each other, doesn't mean we have to be at each other's throats. We can have a different conversation, airing out our differences. That's theoretically a good thing. That's how you find out what really is true and what isn't true. And so, to that extent, any kind of conversation, not just religious conversations, any kind of conversation that's aimed at convincing someone that your view is right and they need to consider X, Y, or Z, you're trying to convert someone. And all Christianity especially, it's a historical-based religion. It's based upon a historical event. So converting someone to Christianity quite often is a matter, in part of it, is persuading them that this historical event actually happened. How is it any different than any other debate that historians have all the time about whether some certain particular historical event happened? So there's nothing wrong with trying to convert someone because you're really just trying to persuade them. And I think we need, as a culture, need to get past this idea that we shouldn't be doing that. Now, as a practical matter, we all know what the real world is like, right? You ever had a conversation with someone and have them get angry with you?
No.
I mean,
That's never happened before.
As a practical matter, I mean, it does. You especially when you get into politics or religion or things like that. It's like mere disagreement. All of a sudden, people want to go at each other's throats.
Especially online. I don't understand why, but people just like lose the ability to control themselves online. It's really weird.
It's the anonymity of the keyboard. You know, you feel almost anonymous and empowered when you're behind a keyboard and you're not face to face with someone. That's why I don't generally like having conversations apologetic conversations online. I mean, I do it, but I much prefer to have them face to face for that reason, because people are going to be much more reasonable with you when they're confronted with you face to face. Now, that being said, because we all know this is a practical reality, I'm going to refer you, Gabby, and anybody else who has the same question, to a book by Greg Koukl. My favorite. I refer people to it all the time. It's called Tactics, and the book Tactics it's about developing a game plan for how to go about having these practical conversations with people. And one thing Greg Koukl talks about in the very beginning of his book is what he calls the Columbo tactic. If you don't know who Columbo is, ask your parents. All right? You know Columbo, right? I've gotten you to watch a few Columbo episodes, haven't I?
Yes, I believe you have. He's who I think he is.
She does.
That's not true.
Columbo is a detective.
Yeah, see,
TV
no,
show.
I do remember who it is.
All I said was a detective. How many detective shows have you seen?
A lot, but I remember which one you're talking about.
Played by Peter Falk, and he asks a lot of questions.
Yeah, see, I do remember this.
That's why Greg Koukl kind of names his first tactic about after Columbo, because the point is, if you're trying to have a conversation with someone, it's a lot easier to do that and prevent it from getting to be hostile and angry if you're the one asking questions. It serves a couple things. First of all, it lets the other person know that you're interested in what they have to say, and also it keeps you out of the hot seat. You're not the one making any claims, right? If you're asking questions, whoever makes a claim has to support it. If you're the one that says Jesus rose from the dead, all right, then anybody, if you go up and you say that to someone, then that person would be perfectly justified looking at you and saying, why do you think that? All right, and making you have the burden of proof to provide the evidence for that. And you certainly could do that, and we'll probably talk about that here in a little bit. But if the other one's making the claims and you're the one asking your questions, you're not the one in the hot seat. They are. They're the ones who have to defend whatever their position is. And he talks about 3 different ways that you can use this strategy of asking questions rather than making statements. Also, nobody likes feeling like they're being preached at. And so you walk off and you start rattling off a list, then people are going to feel like they're being preached at, they're being told what to do, and they're automatically going to get defensive. You start asking them questions, they're not as defensive. 3 ways that Greg Koukl talks about using this Columbo tactic. Number 1 is to gather information. Classic question, what do you mean by that? If someone makes some kind of claim, and God will open doors, people will say things around you that will open a door for conversation. The question is, what are you going to do when that happens? The first thing you can do is ask that first Columbo question. What do you mean by that? It allows you to gather information to make sure you understand what their viewpoint is so you don't misstate it, because that's very, very important. You never want to misstate someone's position. You want to treat them with the same fairness that you would want to be treated. It also allows you time to think. The second way you can do it is to reverse the burden of proof. The classic example question, this is, how did you come to that conclusion? If someone said, this is the example like I said, somebody could do to you. If you say Jesus, rose from the dead, they could ask, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Why did you think that? And perfectly fair question. If somebody's making a claim to be true, and you'd be astounded how many times conversations never even go past the second question. Because I would venture to say at least 80 to 90% of the time, the people are out there, especially online, like Sarah was saying, making claims. They have no idea how they came to that conclusion. They came to it because they read it on some meme somewhere and it sounded like something they wanted to believe, so they did. They have no clue if there's any actual evidence or reasons to back it up. So you ask them, how did you come to that conclusion? And that forces them to think through whether they actually have any reasons about that or not. And the third way is to lead the conversation. You can ask questions to kind of direct the conversation in the direction that you want it to go. A skilled lawyer obviously knows how to do this all the time. It's called cross-examination. But you want to do it politely and respectfully. A good example of this, if anybody's familiar, I don't even think show's on anymore. It used to be called The Way of the Master with Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron. Their whole methodology was based on this third use of the Columbo question, where they would walk up and they would ask people questions. And they'd say, so is it wrong to tell a lie? Wait, Sarah, but is it wrong to tell a lie?
Fundamentally, yes. But there can be a lot of reasons where the better option at the time is to lie.
All right, let me ask you this. Is it wrong to murder someone?
Yes.
Is it wrong to steal things that don't belong to you?
But I feel like you're going to flip these back on me. Give a definite answer. That's why I'm trying not to give definite answers.
But that's the point. First you get people to commit to broad things like this. You just ask them, hey, is it wrong to steal? Yes. Have you ever stolen anything? Even as I'm not going to make you answer this on camera. That's okay. But that's what Ray Comfort would do. Is say, have you ever stolen anything? Even as far as like a pencil from your workplace. And of course, the vast majority of people would admit that, yeah, they have stolen a paperclip or whatever. They've stolen something. And so by using questions, Ray Comfort would direct the conversation in a certain direction to get people to realize that they're lying, thieving adulterers at heart, and and that they deserve to go to hell, basically, based upon their own works, of the crimes that they've committed, so to speak. But that's an example of the third use of the Columbo question, or the Columbo tactic. So inevitably, no matter how polite you are, even when you're asking questions, there are going to be some people that are going to be upset. Your job is just to be as polite and respectful as you possibly can. But that's the short answer, or not so short answer, to your question, Gabby. I think that I'd recommend you read that book. It's very accessible to not all age groups. A toddler couldn't read it, but it's not a very difficult read. But asking questions, rather than making statements, asking questions is a great way to navigate conversations today. So what we got next?
Next is who I'm assuming is their Gabby's sibling, Joseph Spencer. Shout out to Joseph Spencer. What is the best way to back up a Pascal's wager argument?
Pascal's wager. This one I'm kind of glad I got ahead of time because, I don't know if I would have given... it's not that I don't know Pascal's wager, I do. It's just a matter I really appreciated having the time to reflect on this one because I personally not a big fan of Pascal's wager. I got to be honest with you, but I know some people that are. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pascal's wager, he basically says this. He says, we all have to live as if either God exists or he doesn't exist. We have to govern our lives one way or the other as a practical matter. If God doesn't exist in reality, but we choose to live as if he does, we really don't lose a whole lot. All right? There might be a few earthly pleasures that we haven't been able to partake of, but we don't lose a whole heck of a lot. Compared to if God does exist, but we instead live as if he doesn't, then we lose immeasurably more. Now we've given up eternity, okay? There's a huge amount. So between those two options, what Pascal says is, pragmatically speaking, it makes more sense to live as if God does exist because the downside isn't as much as the alternative, obviously. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, okay, well, that doesn't actually prove that God exists. And to a certain extent, I think they're right. It doesn't. It's a pragmatic argument. It's a probability theory argument. And I think to really understand the value of it, you've got to understand the culture that Pascal was living in. Pascal was in medieval times, and at the time he was making this argument, he wasn't really confronted, I don't think, with a wide array of different worldviews. And he certainly wasn't trying to address the wide array of different worldviews that we are dealing with today. In his culture at the time, there was pretty much an attitude that they were rejecting logic and reason as ways to know God. And so they kind of rejected these traditional arguments, whether it be the cosmological argument or the teleological argument from design, things like that. They kind of rejected those as being ways to know God. And so you basically had two alternatives. People either believed in God or they were just kind of agnostic. They said, we can't possibly know whether God's out there or not. So Pascal was addressing a very specific phenomenon at his time, looking at these people, that you've got groups of people that are believing in God and groups of people that are saying we can't possibly know anything about God, so it's pointless to even try to say that we believe in him. And what Pascal was saying was, if those are your two alternatives, and if you really can't know, if these reason-based arguments really can't work, then you still, as a practical matter, you have to make a choice. You can't sit back and not make a choice on this, because as a practical matter, you're either going to live your life one of two ways. You're going to live your life as if God does exist, or you're going to live it as if he doesn't. There is no third option. And so when you're making that practical choice about how to live your life, it makes more sense pragmatically to live your life as if God does exist, to take that part of the gamble. And so he was addressing a very specific phenomenon at a very specific time in history. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any practical application nowadays. I think it does when you're dealing with this situation. You do still come across people sometimes nowadays who either think that reason can't point to God, or they think that they just reject these logical arguments altogether. That's not me. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of the logical arguments for God, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument. I'm a huge fan of those. But some people don't. And if you're confronted with someone who rejects those, then maybe you do move to a practical argument. You do move to a kind of Pascal's wager type of situation. So, Joseph, I think I think when you're dealing with Pascal's wager, you have to keep in mind the culture that it came out of and the purposes of what it was intended to prove. I think a lot of people nowadays misstate Pascal's wager, and they try to make it look like Pascal was trying to create some kind of logical argument that could definitively prove the existence of God. That's not what he was trying to do. It was a probability theory argument. And it was a great probability theory argument. And so it has a very limited application. But if you come across that limited situation, then yes, I think it can be a valuable argument to present.
Every time you say Pascal, I think of the chameleon from Tangled.
Hope we don't have to pay royalties to Disney now because you mentioned it. No, I'm kidding.
Whoops, sorry.
No, who are you kidding? I put images from The Lion King in a video a little while ago. So.
Video not sponsored by Disney. Don't sue us.
All right, next question.
Is there any historical evidence that Jesus actually came back from the dead, or is that something we just have to take on faith? I can sentence.
You what? You can sentence? Again, you hear this kind of thing a lot. Is there historical evidence for the resurrection, or do we have to just take something on faith? Those aren't mutually exclusive alternatives. A lot of people misunderstand and misrepresent what Christian faith is. You ever heard the term like blind faith? And that's what people think of Christian faith as being. And they say that, Christians, you say you have faith in something. That means that you believe it even though there's no evidence for it. That is not what the Bible means by faith. Maybe a better translation or better way of looking at it would be trust. What the Bible means by faith is trust. And I often use the example of my son, who is now 10, so he doesn't do this to me anymore, thankfully. Please don't, my back will hurt. But when he was younger, he used to stand on the stairs. And there were times I'd have my back turned to him, and he would, all of a sudden, I'd hear from behind me, "Daddy!" And I turn around, and he's already in midair, jumping towards me. Now, he had faith that I was going to catch him. Now, could he know with 100% logical certainty that I was going to catch him? No, especially when he did it with my back was turned. But I never dropped him. Just want to say that for the record. Never dropped him. But he had faith. In other words, he trusted that I was going to catch him. Now, it was based upon reasonable belief. I mean, because he'd done this a million times in the past, and I'd always caught him every single time. So it's not that his faith was blind faith. There was a reason behind it. Christian faith is the same way. It's belief, it's supported by reason, but it's trust. It's taking that step to trust Jesus. God has given us plenty of reasons to believe in him. Now, that being said, now that we dispose of this false dichotomy that it's either got to be evidence or it's got to be faith, yes, the answer to the question is yes. And there's lots of historical facts that are accepted by the vast majority of historians that if you put them together, really make a really strong argument for the fact that the resurrection actually occurred. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't want to say that, the vast majority of historians out there agree that the resurrection was a historical event. That is not true. But you look at what they do believe, and it kind of makes you wonder, how can you not? Because there's really no other explanation for these other facts. Just to give you a few examples, and these are from William Lane Craig, apologist who's, much better than me. Fact number 1, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Fact number 2, on the Sunday following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Fact number 3, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. In fact, or at least what they believed to be appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. In fact, number 4, the original disciples believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. These are 4 facts that are, because for very good reasons, most historians hold to be correct. But then if you look at them, you start to realize, well, how can those 4 facts be true? Is there anything else that can explain those 4 facts other than he really did, in fact, rise from the dead? To give you a couple of examples, You talk about, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Well, we have multiple attestation of that. We talked about at the beginning about the different tests historians do. There's multiple documents that talk about the fact that this actually happened. Why is it important that it was by Joseph of Arimathea? Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. All right, he was a member of the Jewish ruling council. For those of you that are familiar with your Christian history, early Christians didn't have a real good relationship with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And so the fact that they admitted that, hey, there was a member of this ruling council that actually did right by Jesus, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And that's a kind of embarrassing detail they wouldn't want to admit, and that was actually true. So you can go through all four of these facts. I'm not going to go through all of them, and provide support like that about reasons why historians accept them. And then you ask yourself, well, what else explains these four facts other than the resurrection? And some people will say, well, Jesus didn't really die on the cross, the swoon theory, so to speak. Well, number one mentioned that Jesus was in fact crucified and he was buried in the tomb. He died. That's one of those facts. And so it's like, no, okay, once you look at the foundations for these facts and you say, okay, if all these four facts are true, what can explain them? Then you got to ask yourself, well, do these theories that come up, do they contradict any of these facts? And if they contradict any of these facts, then those theories can't be true. Did the disciples steal the body? That's another one that's very common, that people say the disciples came in to steal the body. Well, what did fact number 4 say? No, the disciples legitimately believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Would they legitimately believe that if they stole the body? No, they would know he didn't rise from the dead. They know they stole the body. All right, so that's how you evaluate these alternate views. And when you start evaluating all these alternate views, you kind of come to one conclusion. None of them work. None of them fit the historical facts as we know them. So it's called inference to the best explanation. What best explains these historical facts that we know to be true? And really the only explanation that does make sense is, yeah, Jesus really did rise from the dead. All right, I think we're already running way over here, so why don't we just try to do 2 more questions real quick. All right, so go ahead, Sarah. What else you got?
Doesn't evolution explain how all life began?
No. Next question. Sorry, I was trying to get a short answer.
No.
Look, I want to be fair. There are many well-meaning Christians who believe in evolution. There are many well-meaning Christians who do not. And so I don't want to kind of step quite into that phrase so much as I want to say, look, even if you weren't a Christian, if we were looking at this purely scientifically, all right, you still need to be objective and ask yourself, does the evidence support the conclusions that are out there? Because there is nobody on this earth that is immune from believing something because they want to believe it and interpreting the evidence in such a way that they're drawing conclusions from it that really aren't warranted because they support a conclusion that they want to be true. And I'm sorry, but that is very, very true in the world of evolution. Scientists really, sometimes the conclusions they arrive at are not logically supported from the evidence that they have. When you're talking about evolution, you need to understand something. When somebody talks to you, asks you a question about evolution, I think the first thing you've got to do is one of those Columbo questions. What do you mean by that? Because there's at least 3 different senses that we can take evolution to mean. Number 1, evolution just in the general sense of meaning change over time. Yeah, everybody believes in change over time. I mean, I am not the same weight I was a year ago, all right? I have changed over time. So in that sense, I agree. Evolution is absolutely true. I have evolved over the course of the past year. My back is in more pain, yeah.
Evolved.
Well, in a general sense, that's what evolution means. It means change over time. And so nobody disagrees with that. Then there's also the level of what's called microevolution. Microevolution are changes within a species. The famous experiment, and Darwin did an experiment on the Galapagos Islands with finches, where he was measuring the size of finch beaks, and he noted that due to different changes in the food supply, etc., that certain types of beaks were favored, and over time, these finches' beaks of the population changed to as a direct result, or was he proposing as a result of the change in the food supply. And so he noted a change within finch beaks as a result of natural selection. Newsflash, nobody disagrees with that. Microevolution, change within a species, is not controversial at all. Where we get into something different is what's called macroevolution. Macroevolution is when you're basically saying one species can change into another, or new novel forms can develop, so that it's not just staying within the same species, it's changing from one species to another. That's where we have some controversy. Now, I'll tell you in a general sense, what you see lots of times is people will take evolution or evidence that favors microevolution and just act like it automatically favors macroevolution. That's not true. And so you always have, first thing I'd say is ask yourself when you're examining these questions, is this evidence really for showing microevolution or is it showing macroevolution? Because most of the time it's really just showing microevolution, but they're drawing conclusions based on macro. As far as, does macroevolution, does the evidence really support it? The answer is no, and I'll just give you one example because we got to move on about where I don't think it necessarily, the case is a closed case for macroevolution. And this comes from a gentleman, Stephen Meyer, who wrote a book, Darwin's Doubt. And what you need to understand, first of all, is all life is, can be divided into certain categories. You have, at the highest level, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so basically, as you're categorizing different types of creatures, all right, based upon similar traits, things like that. And the higher level, the higher taxonomic categories are the broader, are going to include a lot more. And then as you narrow down, you'll move your way down through the taxonomic categories. Well, what Stephen Meyer points out is about 542 million years ago, there was something called the Cambrian explosion. And this was a period of time over about 20 to 25 million years, which on the evolutionary radar scale is a blip on the radar screen. Okay, that's as far as how long it takes things to evolve, 20 to 25 million years ain't that long at all. All right. During that really, really short period of time, however, virtually every single type of phyla, of the phylum category that I mentioned, every type of body type that we see today, all of a sudden developed, all of a sudden appeared on the screen, and there was no precursor to them. If you look in the fossil record, you don't see anything before the Cambrian explosion that shows them gradually developing. They don't gradually develop, just boom, all of a sudden, all these different body types automatically all of a sudden appear. Well, we all know something about DNA, right? DNA is the instruction manual for you. It's for building whatever creature it is that it's in. And no, you can't take amphibian DNA and put it inside a dinosaur and fill in gaps to create a dinosaur. That doesn't really work, no matter what Jurassic Park says, just so you know. Don't try to develop any dinosaurs. But the idea is it's basically information. It's a textbook. It's a manual, instruction manual, how to build a Sarah. That's what your DNA book is.
$9.99 sold at your local Target.
But it's filled with information. And what Stephen Meyer points out is the Cambrian explosion, there's really no accounting for where it required so much new information for all these new body forms to develop so rapidly, required an influx of enormous amounts of genetic information. And there's no explanation for where it could have come from. Evolution does not have a mechanism. The evolutionary theory does not adequately explain where all that new, novel information could have come from to account for all these rapidly developing body forms. So that's just one example. That's a challenge that we have with evolution out there. Now, does this mean, again, speaking purely scientifically, that evolution is false? No, it doesn't. And I think a lot of scientists get very defensive about that. But it is a challenge. It's a problem that needs to be answered. And science being science, you shouldn't be shying away from challenges. If we're really looking for truth, you should be embracing challenges, not getting defensive about them, but instead trying to say, yeah, that is a problem. Even Darwin recognized that was a problem when he first wrote his book. And so that's something that needs to be addressed. One more question. What do we got?
Last question we're going to do is, isn't religion responsible for more wars and more deaths than anything else in history? Doesn't this make religion dangerous?
No. Next, we're done. All right. I've got to answer those last two really quickly. No. This is another tactic that Greg Koukl mentioned in his book is just the facts, ma'am. And it's basically some questions that come up, you need to know your facts. You need to know your facts. It's not, you can't, no amount of questions, Columbo questions is going to get you to a resolution. This is one of those examples. And it's because the question itself is just wrong. I mean, it is a leading misconception that's out there. You'll hear all the time people say, oh my gosh, more people have been killed in the name of religion than anything else in history. Not even close. I mean, not even close. It's just a factual mistake. There was a book called The Encyclopedia of Wars by authors Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod, and they documented the history of warfare. 1,763 wars they documented. Out of those 1,763 wars, only 123 of them could even remotely possibly be classified as having a religious cause to them. Overall, it accounted for less than 7% of all wars, and less than 2% of people killed in warfare were from these wars having religious cause. Just to give you an example, people always talk about the Crusades, the Christian Crusades.
Goodness.
Yeah, about 1 to 3 million people were tragically, killed during the Christian Crusades. The Inquisition, about 3,000 people, all right, killed during the Inquisition. Let's compare that to World War I alone. 35 million people killed in World War I, which was for purely secular reasons, had nothing to do with religion whatsoever. So the first response to when people raise something like this is you got to know the facts. That it's just not true. And people that say this, I guarantee you, they haven't researched it. Matter of fact, the Huffington Post, which anybody will tell you is a very liberal-leaning publication, all right, they ran an article on this a few years back, correcting this misconception, saying that no, religion is not responsible for more deaths. It's minuscule on the radar screen. And the last thing I'll say about that is that when you're careful, even with those deaths that are perpetuated in the name of religion, keep in mind it's not all Christianity. There's other religions out there that have gone to war as well. You always have to evaluate these things by the teaching of the founder. In other words, just because someone says they're going to war for Jesus doesn't mean that what the reasons for going to war are actually consistent with what Jesus actually taught, or that Jesus would actually approve of it. And so lots of times people say they're doing something, but they're not really doing it for Jesus. They're doing it for themselves. And so when you look at these reasons for these wars and these killings, you got to compare them to what Jesus actually taught and ask yourself, well, wait a minute. Does this really disprove Christianity? Not so. What does Christianity teach us about the nature of human beings? We're all sinners. We're all fallen. Even those of us who are Christians, we screw up. And so if anything, the fact that you've got more examples of Christian people screwing up only provides further evidence that Christianity's got it right.
Hey.
It is accurately describing us. That's exactly what we would expect if Christianity were to be true, that people would be messing up and doing horrific things at times because we're all sinners. So always ask yourself, is it consistent with what the teachings of the founder are? And if it's not, then you can't blame the founder. You can't blame Jesus for what, stupid people are doing in his name, frankly. But it's also not true. That's the first idea. It's just factually untrue. All right? I think we are more than out of time. So I would first of all, you have any last words you want to say? That sounded bad. That sounded like you were about to get executed.
Don't be stupid. Drive safely. Don't drink and drive, and don't do anything else that's bad. There are too many warnings I can put here.
I am thrilled that you're bringing up the driving examples, because for those of you that don't know, my lovely daughter has just turned, 15 years and 9 months.
And never get in the car with me at the wheel. Not because I'm going to do anything, I just don't trust myself to be good at it.
Well, you've got the no drinking and driving down so far, so I'm encouraged by that. So anyway, thank you very much, Sarah, for representing all your fellow teenagers here today. I know.
The way I thought he was originally going to put that, I was going to go, friends? What friends?
And hopefully something we said here today was encouraging to you, and that answers some of the questions. I encourage you to share this. If you did like this video, do me a favor. Go ahead and please click the thumbs up button, the like button here on the YouTube page. Share this video if you have teenagers in your household, or you know anybody that does. Tell them about the video, because they're probably thinking of one or two of these questions themselves, even if they're not voicing them to you. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. This isn't the only thing we got on here. We got lots of great programming. We got original programming Monday through Thursday. Every single day it goes up on the YouTube channel. So we'll have an awful lot to help you get through your week. All right? That's all I got. You got anything else?
I thought I was asked this question already.
You did. All right. Thank you all very much for tuning in. God bless.
In your word we